Ellie had always loved her little house. Tucked away at the end of a quiet street, it was her sanctuary, a place where she could escape the chaos of the world. The walls were thick, the floors creaked with character, and the attic was filled with the kind of shadows that seemed to breathe when you weren't looking. But lately, the house didn't feel like hers anymore. Something was wrong. Something was inside. It started with the noises. Soft, skittering sounds in the walls, like tiny claws scraping against wood. At first, Ellie dismissed it as mice. She set traps, but they remained untouched, the peanut butter bait hardening under the dim glow of the kitchen light. The noises didn't stop. If anything, they grew louder, more deliberate. Sometimes, she swore she could hear whispers, faint, guttural murmurs that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Then came the missing things. A butter knife vanished from the drawer. A razor disappeared from the bathroom. A pair of scissors went missing from her sewing kit. Ellie tore the house apart looking for them, but they were gone. She tried to convince herself it was forgetfulness, but deep down, she knew better. Something was taking them. Something that didn't want to be found. It happened on a Tuesday night. Ellie was in the kitchen, washing dishes by the light of a single bulb. The rest of the house was dark, the shadows stretching long and hungry across the walls. She was humming to herself, trying to ignore the unease that had settled in her chest, when the light flickered. Once. Twice. Then it went out entirely. Ellie froze, her hands submerged in soapy water. The darkness pressed in around her, suffocating in absolute. She fumbled for the flashlight she kept in the drawer, but it wasn't there. Of course it wasn't. She'd left it on the counter, hadn't she? Or had she? Her heart pounded as she strained to listen. The house was silent, but it was the kind of silence that felt alive, like it was holding its breath. And then she heard it. A soft, wet sound, like something being dragged across the floor. It was coming from the hallway. Ellie's breath caught in her throat. She grabbed a knife from the dish rack and stepped out of the kitchen, her bare feet silent on the cold linoleum. The hallway was pitch black, but she could feel it, something was there. Something was watching. She reached for the light switch, but before her fingers could touch it, the sound came again, closer this time. Ellie's hand trembled as she flicked the switch. Nothing happened. The power was out. Or had they done something to it? The thought sent a shiver down her spine. She took a step back, her grip tightening on the knife, and that's when she saw it. A pair of eyes. Small, glowing, and impossibly dark, like voids reflecting the faintest hint of light. They blinked once, then disappeared. Ellie's scream caught in her throat. She stumbled backward, her mind racing. What was that? A rat? A trick of the shadows? No. Rats didn't have eyes like that. Rats didn't move with such purpose. She fled to her bedroom, locking the door behind her. She spent the rest of the night huddled under the covers, clutching the knife, listening to the sounds of movement in the walls. They were louder now, more insistent. And they were coming from everywhere. Over the next few days, Ellie's life became a nightmare. The creatures, whatever they were, grew bolder. She caught glimpses of them in the corners of her vision, small, hunched figures with leathery skin and too many joints in their limbs. They moved quickly, darting into shadows whenever she turned to look. They were smart, too. Smarter than any animal had a right to be. One morning, she found the kitchen in disarray. The drawers had been pulled open, utensils scattered across the floor. The knives were missing. All of them. Ellie's stomach churned as she realized what they were doing. They were arming themselves. She tried to fight back. She bought more traps, stronger lights, and even a can of pepper spray. But the creatures were always one step ahead. They dismantled the traps, chewed through the cords of her lamps, and hid in the shadows where the light couldn't reach. They were toying with her, she realized. Testing her. Waiting for the right moment to strike. The final straw came when she found the note. It was scrawled on a piece of paper torn from her notebook, the handwriting jagged and uneven. We see you. We hear you. We are hungry. Ellie's hands shook as she read the words. They could write. They could think. And they were planning something. She could feel it in the air, a tension that grew thicker with each passing day. The creatures were preparing for something big. That night, Ellie decided to take matters into her own hands. She armed herself with a flashlight, a hammer, and a can of bug spray. She would find their nest, she told herself. She would destroy them before they could hurt her. But as she crept through the house, her resolve began to waver. The shadows seemed to shift and writhe, the whispers growing louder, more urgent. She could feel them watching her, their eyes glowing in the dark. She found the nest in the attic. The door was ajar, the faintest hint of light spilling through the crack. Ellie hesitated, her heart pounding in her chest. This was it. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. The attic was filled with them. Dozens of the creatures, their eyes glinting in the dim light. They were gathered around a makeshift table, their tiny hands clutching knives, scissors, and razors. They turned to look at her, their faces twisted into grotesque smiles. And then they attacked. Ellie fought back with everything she had, but there were too many of them. They swarmed her, their claws digging into her skin, their teeth sinking into her flesh. She screamed, but no one came to help her. No one ever would. When it was over, the creatures dragged her body into the walls, where the light couldn't reach. They feasted in the dark, their whispers growing louder, more triumphant. And as the last of Ellie's life faded away, she realized the terrible truth: the house had never been hers. It had always belonged to them. The rain hammered against the windows of the antique shop like 1,000 tiny fists, each one begging to be let in. The air inside was thick with the scent of aged wood, dust, and something else, something faintly metallic, like the tang of blood. Ethan Harper stood in the dimly lit shop, his coat dripping onto the warped wooden floor. He hadn't planned on stopping, but the storm had driven him inside, and now he found himself wandering aimlessly through the labyrinth of forgotten relics. The shop was a cluttered mess of mismatched furniture, cracked porcelain dolls, and tarnished silverware. But it was the paintings that caught Ethan's eye. They lined the walls like silent sentinels, their subjects frozen in time. Portraits of stern-faced men, landscapes of rolling hills, and still lives of wilting flowers. None of them spoke to him until he saw it. The painting was small, no larger than a sheet of paper, but it seemed to radiate an eerie presence. It was a simple scene, a dimly lit room with a single chair in the center. The chair was empty, but something about the way it was positioned made Ethan feel as though it was waiting for someone. The brushstrokes were rough, almost frantic, and the colors were muted, dominated by shades of gray and brown. But it was the atmosphere of the painting that drew him in, a sense of unease, of something lurking just out of sight. Interested in that one, a voice croaked from behind him. Ethan turned to see an old man standing there, his face lined with deep wrinkles and his eyes clouded with cataracts. He was hunched over, leaning heavily on a cane, and his smile revealed a row of yellow teeth. "It's interesting," Ethan said, turning back to the painting. "What's the story behind it?" The old man chuckled, a sound like dry leaves rustling in the wind. "No story, really. It's been here for years. No one ever buys it. Too unsettling, I suppose." Ethan frowned. There was something about the painting that called to him, something he couldn't quite put into words. "How much?" The old man's smile widened. "For you? $50. And a word of advice, don't hang it in your bedroom." Ethan ignored the warning. He paid the man, took the painting, and left the shop, the rain still pouring down around him. That night, Ethan hung the painting in his living room, directly across from his couch. He sat there for a while, staring at it, trying to figure out what had drawn him to it. The room in the painting was so ordinary, yet so unnerving. The chair seemed to beckon him, as if inviting him to sit down. But he shook off the feeling and went to bed. The next morning, something was different. Ethan noticed it as soon as he walked into the living room. The painting had changed. The chair was no longer empty. A figure sat in it, hunched over, its face hidden in shadow. The room around it was darker, the shadows deeper, and there was something on the floor, a dark pool that could have been water or blood. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He blinked, rubbed his eyes, and looked again. The figure was still there. He stepped closer, his breath catching in his throat. The details were sharper now, more defined. The figure's hands were clenched into fists, its shoulders trembling as if it were crying. The pool on the floor was definitely blood. "What the hell?" Ethan muttered. He considered calling someone, but who would he call? The police? They'd think he was crazy. An art expert? They'd tell him he was imagining things. He decided to wait, to see if the painting changed again. That night, he barely slept. He kept getting up to check the painting, but it remained the same, the figure in the chair, the blood on the floor. When he finally drifted off, his dreams were filled with shadowy figures and the sound of weeping. The next morning, the painting had changed again. This time, the figure was standing, its back to the viewer. The room was even darker, the shadows almost swallowing the figure whole. The blood on the floor had spread, forming a trail that led out of the room and into the darkness beyond. Ethan's hands were shaking as he reached for his phone. He scrolled through his contacts, looking for someone, anyone, who might be able to help. But he stopped when he noticed something else. The figure in the painting, it was wearing a coat. A coat that looked just like his. "No," he whispered. "This isn't happening." He tore the painting off the wall and shoved it into a closet, slamming the door shut. He spent the rest of the day trying to distract himself, but his mind kept drifting back to the painting. What was it? How was it changing? And why did it feel like it was watching him? That night, he dreamed of the painting again. This time, he was inside it. He was sitting in the chair, his hands clenched into fists, his shoulders trembling. The room was dark, the shadows closing in around him. He could feel something in the darkness, something watching him, waiting for him. He tried to get up, but he couldn't move. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. When he woke up, he was drenched in sweat. The clock on his bedside table read 3:07 a.m. The house was silent, but he could feel something, a presence, a weight, pressing down on him. He got up and went to the closet, his heart pounding in his chest. The painting was still there, but it had changed again. The figure was gone. The chair was empty. But the room was different, it was his living room. The couch, the coffee table, the TV, everything was there, rendered in the same rough brush strokes, the same muted colors. And there was something else. A figure, standing in the corner of the room, just out of sight. Ethan couldn't see its face, but he knew it was looking at him. He slammed the closet door shut and backed away, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. He needed to get rid of the painting, but he didn't know how. He couldn't just throw it away. What if it came back? He needed to destroy it, but the thought of touching it made his skin crawl. He spent the rest of the night sitting on the couch, staring at the closet door, waiting for the sun to rise. The next morning, Ethan took the painting to a local art restorer. The woman who ran the shop was in her 50s, with short gray hair and a no-nonsense demeanor. She looked at the painting with a critical eye, her lips pursed in thought. "This is unusual," she said. "The brushwork is erratic, almost frenzied." And the subject matter, she trailed off, shaking her head. "Where did you get this?" "An antique shop," Ethan said. "It's been changing. Every night, it's different." The woman raised an eyebrow. "Changing how?" Ethan explained, his voice trembling as he described the figure in the chair, the blood on the floor, the room that had become his living room. The woman listened in silence, her expression unreadable. "I've heard stories like this before," she said when he was finished. "Cursed paintings, haunted artifacts. Most of them are just urban legends," but she hesitated, then handed the painting back to him. "I'm sorry, but I can't help you. You should get rid of it. Burn it, if you can." Ethan left the shop feeling more desperate than ever. He drove to the edge of town, to a secluded spot in the woods, and dug a hole. He placed the painting in the hole, doused it with gasoline, and lit a match. The flames roared to life, consuming the canvas in seconds. Ethan watched until there was nothing left but ashes. He went home, exhausted but relieved. The painting was gone. It was over. That night, Ethan slept soundly for the first time in days. But when he woke up, the painting was back. It was hanging on the wall, just as it had been before. The scene was different now, a dark hallway, lined with doors. At the end of the hallway was a figure, its face still hidden in shadow. But Ethan knew who it was. He could feel it in his bones. He tore the painting off the wall and threw it to the ground, stomping on it until the frame splintered and the canvas ripped. He gathered the pieces and threw them into the fireplace, watching as they burned to ash. But when he turned around, the painting was back on the wall. This time, the figure was closer. It was standing in the middle of the hallway, its head tilted to one side, as if it were listening. Ethan could see its hands now, long, bony fingers, curled into claws. The shadows around it seemed to writhe and twist, as if they were alive. Ethan backed away, his heart pounding. He could feel the presence again, stronger than ever. It was in the room with him, watching him, waiting. He turned and ran, slamming the door behind him. The next few days were a blur. Ethan tried everything he could think of to get rid of the painting, burying it, burning it, even taking it to a priest. But no matter what he did, it always came back. And every night, it changed. The figure grew closer, the scenes more gruesome. He saw himself in the painting, his face twisted in terror, his body broken and bleeding. He stopped sleeping. He stopped eating. He could feel the painting's presence everywhere he went, a constant weight on his chest. He knew it was only a matter of time before the figure stepped out of the painting and into his world. The final night came without warning. Ethan was sitting on the couch, staring at the painting. The figure was close now, so close he could see the details of its face, or rather, the lack of it. Its features were blurred, as if they had been smeared away. Its mouth was a gaping hole, its eyes empty sockets. It reached out a hand, its fingers brushing against the edge of the canvas. Ethan tried to move, but he was frozen in place. He could only watch as the figure stepped out of the painting, its body unfolding like a spider emerging from its web. It was taller than he had imagined, its limbs too long, its movements too fluid. It loomed over him, its head tilting to one side, as if studying him. And then it spoke. Its voice was a low, guttural growl, like the sound of bones grinding together. "You should have listened," it said. "You should have left it alone." Ethan tried to scream, but no sound came out. The figure reached for him, its fingers closing around his throat. He felt a sharp pain, then nothing. The next morning, the painting was gone. The wall where it had hung was bare, the only evidence of its existence a faint outline of dust. Ethan was gone too, his house empty and silent. But in the antique shop, the painting was back. It hung on the wall, its scene unchanged, a dimly lit room with a single chair in the center. The chair was empty, but it wouldn't be for long. The old man stood in front of the painting, a smile on his face. "Another one," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They never learn." And as the rain hammered against the windows, the painting waited for its next victim. The house on Elmwood Lane was a dream come true for the Carter family. Nestled at the edge of a dense forest, it was a sprawling Victorian mansion with ivy crawling up its weathered stone walls. The real estate agent had called it a fixer-upper, but to Sarah and Mark Carter, it was perfect. Their two children, Emily and Jake, were thrilled by the idea of exploring the creaky old house, with its endless hallways and mysterious nooks. The price was too good to pass up, and the family moved in just 2 weeks after signing the papers. The first few days were a whirlwind of unpacking and settling in. The house was larger than they had imagined, with rooms that seemed to stretch on forever. The children claimed they heard whispers in the walls, but Sarah dismissed it as the wind. Mark, ever the skeptic, laughed it off as their overactive imaginations. But as the days turned into nights, the house began to reveal its secrets. It was Emily who found the door. She had been playing hide-and-seek with Jake when she stumbled upon a narrow hallway on the 3rd floor. The wallpaper was peeling, and the air smelled damp, but what caught her attention was the small, almost invisible door at the end of the hall. It was no taller than 4 feet, with a rusted handle and no visible keyhole. "Mom! Dad! Come look," she called, her voice echoing through the empty halls. Sarah and Mark arrived moments later, followed by Jake, who was clutching a flashlight. Mark knelt down to examine the door, running his fingers along its edges. It was made of heavy oak, and the wood was warped with age. "Looks like it's been sealed shut," Mark said, frowning. "Probably just a storage closet." "But why would they seal it?" Sarah asked, her voice tinged with unease. Mark shrugged. "Who knows? Maybe it's unstable. We should probably leave it alone." But the children protested, their curiosity piqued. After a few minutes of arguing, Mark relented. He fetched a crowbar from the garage and, with a few forceful tugs, pried the door open. A cloud of dust billowed out, making them cough and step back. The air that escaped was cold and stale, carrying with it a faint, metallic smell. Mark shone the flashlight inside, revealing a small, windowless room. The walls were covered in faded, peeling wallpaper, and the floor was littered with debris. In the center of the room was an old wooden desk, its surface covered in a thick layer of dust. On top of the desk lay a leather-bound diary, its pages yellowed with age. "Creepy," Jake whispered, his eyes wide. Sarah stepped inside, her heart pounding. She picked up the diary and brushed off the dust. The cover was embossed with the initials EH. "Who's EH?" Emily asked, peering over her mother's shoulder. "I don't know," Sarah said, flipping through the pages. "But it looks like a diary. Maybe it belonged to the previous owner." Mark frowned. The real estate agent said the house had been vacant for years. No one mentioned anyone named EH. Sarah hesitated, then opened the diary to the first page. The handwriting was neat but hurried, the ink faded to a pale brown. She began to read aloud. Entry 1, September 12, 1987. "I've finally moved into the house on Elmwood Lane. It's everything I've ever wanted, quiet, secluded, perfect for my work. But there's something about this place that unsettles me. I keep hearing noises in the walls, like whispers. I tell myself it's just the wind, but I can't shake the feeling that I'm not alone." Sarah paused, her voice trembling. The room seemed to grow colder, the shadows deepening around them. "Keep reading," Jake urged, his eyes glued to the diary. Sarah turned the page. Entry 5, September 20th, 1987. "The whispers are getting louder. I can't sleep. Every night, I hear them calling my name. I've tried to ignore it, but last night, I saw something. A shadow, moving in the corner of my room. It was there for only a moment, but I know what I saw. I'm not crazy. This house is alive." Mark scoffed. "Sounds like this EH person was a few sandwiches short of a picnic." Sarah shot him a look. "Mark, this is serious. What if something really happened here?" He shrugged. "It's an old house. Old houses make noises. End of story." But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled over her. She continued reading. Entry 12, October 3rd, 1987. "I've started locking my door at night. The shadows are everywhere now. They follow me, watching me. I've tried to leave, but every time I get to the edge of the property, something pulls me back. It's like the house won't let me go. I've begun to hear voices, too. They're faint, but I can make out what they're saying. They want me to join them." Emily tugged on Sarah's sleeve. "Mom, I'm scared." Sarah closed the diary, her hands trembling. "Maybe we should stop for now." But Jake grabbed the diary from her hands. "No. I want to know what happens." Before Sarah could stop him, he flipped to the next entry and began to read. Entry 20, October 15th, 1987. "I've started to see them. The people in the walls. They're pale, their eyes hollow, their mouths twisted into grotesque smiles. They beckon to me, urging me to come closer. I can't resist anymore. I've started to carve symbols into the walls, hoping to keep them at bay. But it's no use. They're getting stronger. I can feel them inside me, twisting my thoughts, driving me mad." Jake's voice faltered, and he dropped the diary as if it had burned him. The room was silent, the air thick with tension. Even Mark looked uneasy now. "Okay, that's enough," Sarah said firmly, picking up the diary. "We're not reading any more of this." But as she turned to leave the room, the door slammed shut with a deafening crash. The flashlight flickered and went out, plunging them into darkness. "Mom? Dad?" Emily's voice was barely a whisper. Sarah fumbled for the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. "Mark, help me!" Mark joined her, pulling at the handle with all his strength, but it was no use. The door was sealed shut. And then they heard it. A low, guttural whisper, coming from the walls. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, more insistent. The words were unintelligible, but the tone was unmistakable, malicious, hungry. "Get away from the walls!" Sarah screamed, pulling the children to the center of the room. The whispers grew louder, filling the room with a cacophony of voices. The air grew colder, and the shadows seemed to come alive, twisting and writhing like living things. Sarah clutched the diary to her chest, her mind racing. And then, in the darkness, she saw them. Pale, gaunt faces emerged from the walls, their hollow eyes fixed on the family. Their mouths twisted into grotesque smiles as they reached out, their bony fingers clawing at the air. Sarah screamed, and the room erupted into chaos. When the door finally burst open, the family stumbled out, gasping for breath. The whispers stopped, and the shadows receded, but the memory of what they had seen would haunt them forever. They moved out of the house the next day, leaving behind the diary and the forgotten room. But sometimes, late at night, Sarah would wake up to the sound of whispers, and she would wonder if they had ever truly escaped. The house on Elmwood Lane still stands, its secrets hidden behind a sealed door. And if you listen closely, you might hear the whispers, calling out to you, urging you to come closer. But beware, once you enter the forgotten room, you may never leave.